Good evening, and welcome to the inaugural stream of the Sanctum Secorum Reading Room. Whether you are new to the literary world of Appendix N, a diehard fan of the genre, or even just tuning in to see how certain titles tie into a particular set of role-playing games, we invite you to join us as we dive into the history and influence of Appendix N. We'd like to open our library to you and inspire readers to explore these new worlds. I am Keeper Jen, and with me tonight we have Keeper Mark.
Hi, everyone.
And Keeper Bob.
Hey, folks.
And with the Keepers of Mystery, we're crossing the streams a little bit, and we have Judge Julian from this podcast called Spellburn.
I think I've heard of it.
I'm not really a keeper. I'm more of a throwback, probably. But
I mean, last name starts with B. We're all good there, right?
right.
Oh my God.
It's the J's and the B's. Is that the
J's and the
rule?
B's, that really is how it's worked out. Yeah.
Funny that. Well, folks, tonight in this first episode of the Reading Room, we are, of course, examining the Dying Earth stories of Jack Vance. Mark, do we have a synop?
Sure do. The 6 stories that make up the first volume of The Dying Earth are all set in an undefined far future Earth, when the sun is nearing the end of its life. The sky ranges from a pink to deep blue, lit by a dim red sun, and many strange planets or plants and animals exist. Much of the story is set within the forested country of Ascalay and in the ruined cities that dot the landscape. Seekers of wisdom and beauty include lovely lost women, eccentric wizards, and man-eating melancholic Diodans, Twickmen ride dragonflies and trade information for salt. There are monsters and demons. It is a world where each being is morally ambiguous. The evil are charming, the good are dangerous.
Isn't
With
that?
that, we'll open our reading room for this, what is turning out to be the month of Vance for us in Goodman Games.
Right?
Yes.
I think I've read and reread Dying Earth more in the past month than I have in the past several years on the project, but it's been fantastic.
It doesn't.
Okay, so some stuff that really pops out to us. Go for it, Julian.
I would say it doesn't. It is interesting because I did a little bit of rereading for tonight's event, and I tried to kind of dip in and survey from all 4 books. Actually, I think I missed Kugel's Saga. I was going to get there and I missed it, but I dipped into the 1, 2, and 4, and I was struck by how compact they are. I mean, a lot happens, and a lot of crazy imagination is stuffed into them. But I mean, it probably would only take like 24 hours to read all 4 books. Is that any? I mean, of course.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I would say that wholly depends on your reading abilities.
Yeah, but I mean, not like a Tolkien-esque effort or Robert Jordan or something. I mean,
Yeah.
just considering if you think about sort of standard Appendix N paperback page count instead, something a little less subjective.
Well, I think part of the compactness and density of the stories is because they were short stories. They were all kind of written to stand alone in a much smaller page count, and then they're put together to tell a larger story. But when you're right, there's a difference, right? It's sort of like, I don't know, writing a module versus a rule book, right? I mean, you've got a smaller word count, you've got to focus everything in. And I think for the reader, that really pays off because there's so much there, and there's definitely no wasted verbiage, just strange verbiage.
I mean, I find it really interesting that each of these stories are sort of like isolated, but when I go back and sort of like reflect on Dying Earth and sort of my thoughts about it, I always think of it as the whole set of 4 novels, like the whole span. Like they're all integral to me. Like I and maybe that's the way that I approached it, which is I started, as a reader of these stories with the omnibus edition, and that was, the full 800-page collection, and it always seemed like one complete world, one complete set. Then, but when you dive into the details and you see like sort of like the evidence of these isolated, narratives, the fact that this was written over like 35 years, right? That it spans this huge amount of time, all the way from the 1950s, when what he was writing was so completely different than science fiction. Well, I mean, it obviously it's in that kind of, it feels very of the 70s, of the 80s for me, but it goes back way back in the lineage, goes way back. And like I said, though, like my experience as a reader has always been sort of like the complete story, and it's hard to sort of like break it out into those individual components, now that I've read it so many times in that format.
That's really true. While they were all written at different times and written separately, it does sort of form its own complete narrative. So when you can sit down and you can read it cover to cover in like the big omnibus, like the Fantasy Masterworks Masters of Fantasy set,
and Tales of, yeah,
and it's just it's one big great story.
I had a big omnibus edition that had like a satellite on the cover or something. It was really weird. Like, what had nothing to do, it didn't seem to have anything at all to do with the contents of any of the books or anything. It was the most bizarre cover art that you could really pick outside of something completely non-science fiction.
Yeah, it worked well for Vance's stories, but not so much for the Dying Earth.
Yeah, I mean, obviously has plenty of more, pulpy sci-fi stuff, which I also love. But so
also wrote some Ellery Queen stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And he has a lot of mystery. A lot of his sci-fi stuff is kind of in the mystery. Mysteries embedded in the sci-fi. The demon princes. There's a lot of mystery elements and stuff like that.
Well,
I don't know. He doesn't do it in Dying Earth, though, does he?
I don't think so. I never really got that particular feeling. I mean, certainly some of Vance's other work also kind of focuses on the world gone by sort of thing. The world sort of at the end, like The Last Castle, certainly has that same sort of feeling. I mean, The Last Castle really, in a lot of ways, you could almost drop it into the Dying Earth without even noticing. But I think that's part. Well, there's a few more sci-fi elements to it, and there's no real magic element to it. But it has a very similar feeling, and I mean, I guess part of that feeling, right, is just the way that Vance wrote. I mean, we all kind of talk about Vancian language, and I know that some people just hear that and it makes them feel like the stories are less approachable, but they really aren't.
Yeah, like one of the comments here in the Twitch stream, Mr. McDevitt is casting his charm of Folger's indefatigable pot of extreme wakefulness on himself, as well as grabbing his thesaurus and his ibuprofen. And I kind of feel that.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, authors, if you look at stuff from like 30s, 40s, even into the early 70s, if you look at the way they wrote compared to the way contemporary authors write, there's a huge difference. There's been a massive shift in language overall. But I think that if you're used to reading older science fiction and fantasy, Vancian really isn't anything that's going to throw you for a loop, because you're just going to have to figure it out from context like everybody does.
Yeah.
I've heard so many people say that it feels unapproachable, especially, they get like 2 pages in, they really, really want to give it a shot because of the DCC Dying Earth project that's going on. And they can't get more than a couple of pages in. They feel like they're just in over their heads. And I have a very vehement soapbox on this that, I get that. I totally understand. I feel like the dummy of the group, and don't let this make you feel dumb. Don't let this.
No, not at all. Especially since most of the words that you're looking at going, I don't know what that means. Nobody does.
There's
right?
a good reason.
Vance made them from whole cloth. So
yeah.
I mean,
It's
but that does
yeah.
bring up an interesting question, which is like the kind of the order of chronological order of reading. Those early stories are very much sort of in that kind of older sci-fi fantasy vein, right?
Yeah.
If you reordered them or made a recommendation to say start with a later one, do you think that would be something that some readers would find more approachable, especially the ones that are like the cool stories, are kind of a little bit more of the
Yeah.
tied together the narrative, and they have this,
Yeah.
and they are separate enough from the earlier ones, is that an entry point, for some readers?
I think it is one option. It's a topic that we've been bandying about on the Facebook DCC group for a while now. And if it just feels too wordy, then yeah, jump into the Kugel stories. You might want to do the Eyes of the Overworld before Kugel Saga, but it really depends on what you're more in the mood for. If you just want those, how did you phrase it, Julian? Morally deficient.
What,
If you just want that kind of adventure.
under moralized and over civilized.
Yeah.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Which I also aspire to.
And it's all, yes, you do. But it is a process, and I understand you have to get toes wet before you jump in face first, and I get that. So for kind of a happy medium of, say, fantasy writing in the latter half of the 20th century, try Songs of the Dying Earth and try that compilation that draws on the feel of it, but maybe not on all of the verbosity.
Have any of you read I bought it like 5-6 years ago, actually, when I was overseas of all places, and
Songs of?
Yeah, and it's sitting on my shelf, but I've never actually cracked it.
I read it a while back, and I thought it was really good. I mean, Neil Gaiman's got a story in it. There's some really good stuff. It definitely wasn't written by Vance, but it has that feeling, right? It's not a collection of bad pastiches where you're like, ooh,
Yeah.
no. I mean, the people that wrote these stories really cared about the project and cared about the setting. So,
Right.
so that carries through, and that might be a good way for someone to introduce themselves to the world of the Dying Earth. But at the end of the day, Vance is really the heart and soul of it.
I've never read something by Neil Gaiman that has been too complex. And Julian, to answer your question, I'm in the middle of listening to it again right now.
I loaned it a long time ago when I first read the compendium, which was maybe 15 years ago or something. I came a little bit late to the Vance party, but when I had first read it, I was really blown away, and I recommended it to all my friends and so on and so forth. And actually, nobody complained about the language at all, but I did have one of my friends come back and say, it's boring because there's no characterization. There's no plot and there's no characterization, right? And I think what I think she's probably reading the Kugel stuff rather than the first stories, but the it's true in a sense, right? It's not Dostoevsky or something, right? It doesn't fall into 20th century psychological, deep dives into characterization and all that stuff. He writes these picaresques, which are really a much older tradition, from the 18th century. This, I went here and then I had a short adventure and then I got chased out of here and then I went here and I had a short adventure and I got chased out of here and I went here, and there's like, look at Tom Jones and look at,
Well, and that's definitely the influence of the pulps too, right? I mean, when you're pitching a story that may be only 6,000 to 10,000 words, and you're trying to shop that and get that in while you're still writing the next 3 stories like that. Everything's got to be really tight, and then just being able to string it together makes it more approachable, I think, when you're more commercially approachable, right?
Well,
So,
yeah.
Look at Lankmar.
People like that, and so while people like that, now we can, in the next issue, we can have another one, and that sort of flow really lends itself, one, of course, to collecting it like Dying Earth has been, but also I think keeps the momentum going. Once you get into it, once you know, if even if you have a problem kind of getting started, once you get into it, you're not going to stop until you're done. It's just one of those things. Once you get on that roll, it just doesn't stop.
It's it is a product of the short story, right? Because when you're trying to sell the story, you're saying, well, I got another Kugel story, and your readers know him now, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you don't want to, if you're selling Fafhrd and the Mouser, you don't want to be like, oh, but Fafhrd and Mouser are totally different this time, but still buy my story. You know, I know your readers love him, but I've totally changed everything, you know?
Well,
So-
technically that's what Liber did, because none of it was published in the order that you know it now.
Well, and Howard jumped around in Conan, of course, the way they were.
Right.
But they were still all recognizable as the same character. And you know, there wasn't, while there was character development in the stories, there weren't massive shifts. I mean, you know, Conan might go from a pirate to a gladiator to a king, but he was still very recognizable as Conan, with just, you know, pirate or gladiator or king, you know, as an attachment. And so that keeps it approachable for the audience.
Mr. McDevitt brings up another good point, that all of this was done on a typewriter.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that actually changed the way fiction was put out?
Oh,
I mean, besides having the short episodic publications there, just the little pulps, now you could just churn it out on, you know, word processor. So
I get the sense that for writers at that time, it would have been their native tool, right? And so it would have been less of an impediment than for, you know, our kind of modern approach to it. But
that's
at
fair.
the same time, that's really daunting, right? You know, just to have the skill in order to write a story, and you know, you don't have the kind of modern equipment to be able to go back, edit, you know, save versions of it. There's always this kind of, you know, but that was the medium, you know, for this generation of writers going back, you know, before Vance and well into the 70s and you know, and even into the 80s. But you're right. I think it does. I mean, it's a different type of writing style that, you know, I don't have a lot of experience, you know, with that, and so it's hard for me to like sort of say, you know, what would that do to, you know, your approach to writing.
All I'll add is that I'm glad I'm not his editor.
Well, that's the thing, right? A lot of, if you look back at like the collected papers of Liber or Lovecraft, and you look at the drafts that exist for the stories, they didn't go through a lot of drafts, right? You know, they tried to be very succinct, and they were careful in their word choices to begin with. So there was a lot more thought during the writing process, whereas I think, you know, today, you know, we'll throw down words because we know that we can just go back and we can change them or cut and paste and reorder them. And so I think the style of writing was a lot more methodical. You had to slow down. You really had to select your words, because if it's 10,000 words, you don't want to have to be retyping this thing, you know, 5, 6, 10 drafts down the road. You just want to get it done properly.
Yeah.
Certainly the thing you brought up about the pulps, and a lot of these were published as stories, like a lot of Appendix N, of course, is really relevant to my friend's complaint, and I think to new readers of probably Vance and Appendix N, is that they were selling these as stories, right? So Tolkien didn't publish parts of, you know, the Two Towers in you know, Weird Tales or Tales to Astonish or something, and certainly George R. Martin never did, and Robert Jordan never did. I mean, not any parts of those stories anyway.
Not any part of those stories, yeah.
No. So I mean, so the whole market shifted, I think, with Tolkien to kind of get away from the pulp genre, the high, you know, it shifted to those epic, you know, intricately designed fantasy epics and that kind of stuff.
Well, but I'm not as well or extensively as read in the other Vance works that he's done, but did Vance also shift to that kind of format too for his other stories that he wrote, the other novels that he wrote, or was he still writing kind of episodically and with a pulp style?
Most of the things of his that I've read outside the Dying Earth, so the Demon Princes, and I just read the second Alistair novel, which is a science fiction thing.
Mhm.
And I read the Dragon Masters, which is amazing, you know. But anyway, they were short novels, very short novels. Not the Dragon Masters, maybe more of a novella almost. But I think in a kind of standard pulp paperback thing, nothing more than 200 pages, I don't think, or maybe a few of them barely broke 200 pages. So maybe
that was kind of standard up through the 70s for most of the genre. I mean, you pick up a fairly small, thin paperback, and
yeah.
now, of course, now it's going to be 700 pages, and it's part one of 40.
Right.
And in some ways, I prefer the older way better, and maybe it's just because I'm going gray, but I like to be able to pick up a story and enjoy it, and then move on to something else, as opposed to spend a week, reading something that may or may not be overly dry, and then wait a year and a half for the next volume.
Yeah. I actually just picked up an old sci-fi pulp collection because it had a story in there by Leiber and a small one by Vance, I believe. And I was like, okay, I could sit down and I can read this one little story and put the book down. I'm never going to go back to it, but it did something to my brain. It just started kicking things in. So I'm like, okay, let me go back to the Songs of the Dying Earth. Let me go back to some of these old things that I haven't explored just yet, because even tiny, it's still digestible, and the use of language and the way they formed just sentence structure made me come away from it differently. I mean, I actually got something out of it.
Yeah, I mean, and when you look at authors, especially Vance, he's certainly the quality of his writing was definitely recognized, right? I mean, World Fantasy Award Life Achievement in '84. Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America gave him. He was a grandmaster in the '90s. He won Hugos. He was in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He even won an Edgar Award for some of his Ellery Queen stuff. So this is definitely an author who is very, very prolific, wrote a lot of fantastic things, and yet I don't think his work is as well known as it should be, right? I mean, most folks love Tolkien, and although I really hate the way he breaks into song every 40 pages or so, but everybody knows him. But if you look at his body of work, it's much smaller than Vance's. Everybody has at least heard of Lovecraft, whether for good or bad reasons. Everyone's familiar with Lovecraft, and Cthulhu is now pop culture. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and for some reason, people just aren't as familiar with Vance, and I think that's a real shame. And there's a lot to get out of it.
Well, I was kind of curious about that point, because this Vance is one of these. He seems like an author's author to some extent, or within the genre of that the kind of the D&D or role playing game literature. Once people discover him and sort of discover the origins, it becomes this a figure that has a lot of like currency and renown. But outside of that, he's not very well known, right? I wouldn't say I would say even Leiber is one of these kind of figures that's gotten a lot more sort of mainstream versions, right? The Farfetch'd Grey Mouser stories have a lot of
they appeared in
adaptations there,
yeah.
And so I obviously like Howard and Lovecraft and Tolkien. These are very recognizable names for a lot of even non-fantasy people. But why didn't Vance sort of get even to that sort of tier of of name recognitions that it seems like he should be, based on how much authors like him and how much like he's got attachment within this community?
So rewind everything back to 1983, right? And here's a fox-faced vagabond with his black hair and everything, and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger is Kugel the Clever. I mean, if you compare him to Howard in particular, right? Which is maybe not fair because Howard's kind of at the far extreme of stuff. So maybe a Liber comparison is a little better. But
I would like to see John Milius's version of Kugel Saga, sure.
Sure. I think it would be better as not as Mad Max post-apocalypse, but I think that director, right, would be really fun. I can't remember his name, but think of the last one. That's maybe as close to the Dying Earth like craziness as. Anyway.
Yeah, I think the primary knowledge of the word Vance comes from people who play D&D are often referring to Vancian magic just because that's how Gary referred to it.
Without really knowing what it was.
Exactly.
I mean, when I first started playing and I read Vancian Magic, I had no clue. I'd never read Jack Vance, and I didn't have any context. And so yeah, it was just, well, it's Vancian Magic. What's that mean? It's just called Vancian Magic. And
have you ever? So I wondered a lot this week as I was thinking about this event, like why is there no, I mean, how many pastiches has Conan inspired? Look at what Gardner Fox did. Look at what Lynn Carter did. Look at all these guys who ripped him off and flatteringly imitated him and all that good stuff. And even Liber to a lesser degree, because it got harder and harder because his language is a little more subtly unique and stuff like that. He has maybe a little more of a unique imprint, maybe. Why no create? I mean, can you even imagine anybody really successfully making is there a what's his name? What's the guy who was Lovecraft's imitator? August Derleth, right? Is there an August Derleth for Jack Vance or
Michael Shea? Really? I mean, Michael Shea did one Kugel novel and then one short story, and of course, both were authorized, but the novel was retconned when Vance went back to the character, but he certainly approached it pretty well.
Have you read either of those?
I read the Michael Shea one years ago, and I couldn't tell you much about it, but Michael Shea also, he that's one of the things that he did when he was starting out. He wrote a sequel to The Color Out of Space by Lovecraft. It was The Color Out of Time. And his big thing was he really worked on matching the voice of the author. And so when you read his stuff, yeah, it's definitely, it's not Vance, but it's close. It's not Lovecraft, but it's close. And they certainly kind of followed the tone and feel of things. Well, it's just like when you talk about Dying Earth, a lot of people will talk about like William Hope Hodgson or Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique. And Zothique kind of inspired Dying Earth, and then Dying Earth inspired Book of the New Sun. So there's actually a science fiction subgenre, which is called Dying Earth. And it's that whole concept of it's post-apocalyptic, not because of a cataclysm, but because the laws of the universe have worn out, the sun's going out. And other people, I mean, Lovecraft has wrote a couple stories that fall into that category before it was even created, right? Brian Aldiss, Lynn Carter, Moorcock, the Dancers at the End of Time series. That's classified as Dying Earth, genre-wise. And so it's interesting.
Gene Wolfe is the other one that's bandied around.
Yes, Gene Wolfe's that's the Book of the New Sun. But when you look at it as a broader genre, sort of like Sword and Sorcery was created to describe the stories of Conan, and Dying Earth as a subgenre was named to describe a particular type of story, but it was specifically named for Vance's work. And I mean, technically speaking, even things like Vampire Hunter D and Thundar the Barbarian qualify as Dying Earth, which I thought was kind of fun. But so there's this sort of reverberation that has gone through literature and pop culture that, yes, there were waves of it beforehand with writings by like Byron and Shelley, but once Vance jumped in, that's where it really carried out from. And I don't think people realize how transformative the works were to what we consider the literature today in the genres.
I mean, I think that one of the things that I think that you were talking about, Julian, when we were on Keep Crawling or Keep on Crawling, was why didn't this sort of spawn this sort of its own vein, right? You know, which, to your point, Bob, there is this sort of vein of the Dying Earth stories, but nobody really, I don't think there's a lot of identification, you know, with it. It's sort of like post-apocalyptic, is sort of like the larger umbrella that people look to that.
And most people aren't familiar with the subgenre, yeah.
Right, and this is a very sort of specific, like, okay, what's happening at the end of the Earth, you know, that time. And I think part of this is that, you know, what Vance does in these stories, and what I find really appealing to it is that it has this sense of there's such a varied landscape in everything that happens in the Dying Earth stories. You know, obviously we only have 800 pages of, you know, sort of the core Vance novels, but
yeah, everything
from you know, the science and technology aspect of rediscovering sort of like these lost cities, to the magic, to, you know, the floating castles and traveling and journeying to other space, to the sort of Kugel, you know, picaresque stories. It doesn't feel like I mean, it feels like the landscape is so broad that it's hard to, like, for people to say it is one thing, right? And I think that kind of identification in literature, like with, you know, Conan or with Tolkien or with, you know, these other authors, are you know, it's a lot easier to sort of, you know, carry that identification into like creating like a that vein, you know, that we've been talking about, rather than sort of, you know, obviously influencing a lot, but not necessarily like being attributed, you know, directly or tied back directly to this one author.
I'll posit. I'll try to do my best. That was actually pretty good, but I'll do my best to answer my own question in a very concise way. First of all, you could try to imitate Vance, but not really without the language. And then when you try to imitate Vance's language, it's going to be so crap. It's just
derivative.
Yeah, it's either going to be so completely bald-facedly derivative that it will be ridiculous, or it will or it'll be very wishy-washy and you just won't get there. You know, it's gonna you know, he drops those words when he drops them, and it's not really only about the vocabulary, it's also the very cold concision of the way that he writes, right? And the way that his characters speak, you know.
Concision. Okay, nice.
The dialogue. Oh, the dialogue is fantastic.
Here we go with the Bernickiisms.
Yeah, well, anyway, I may have advanced a word there, but who knows? I'm always trying to advance the language a little bit.
But that's very true, right? I mean, there's not many authors that could create language the way Vance did, and to work with language the way that Vance did. I mean, like, you know, Mervyn Peake with Gormenghast, there's language, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it is more obtuse and less approachable than Vance, because when you're reading a Vance story and he drops a word, even if you don't know what he's naming because it's something of the Dying Earth itself, your brain just sort of accepts it and moves on because it makes sense in the context of the story. You know, if a chair is made out of a particular material, you just go, oh, well, that's some sort of wood, and you keep going. But in your brain, you get that extra flavor, you get that alien flavor to it. And I think that's also key. While Vance Vance is not big on in-depth descriptions, right? I think we can all agree on that.
Yes.
Which is kind of refreshing, to be honest.
But he also was definitely painting a picture. He wasn't trying to take shortcuts or hide things or obfuscate them. He just used his language to give things more of a feel than a visual image in a lot of cases.
Make it more evocative, definitely.
Yeah.
No, very true. And some of it is very visual, but it's also, it brings out the kind of foreignness, and not foreignness even, but the whimsy, for lack of a better word, or the exoticness of his, just the craziness of the imagination. And I suppose some people struggle with that and don't like, it's not necessarily just vocabulary, but it's feeling like they don't know what he's talking about. And then you've got to go with it, right? It's, you throw yourself.
It's hard to break through that barrier, though, and I get that.
Oh yeah, no, I can understand why people wouldn't like that. It might have put me off when I was younger, especially, you know. But as I got older, it's one of those things.
Yeah, you know, when you're younger and you're reading a book and you hit a word you don't know, what's the first thing they say? Well, if you don't know what it is, look it up in the dictionary. That doesn't help you with Vance. That is so misleading when you just can't. But now think about the fact that, you know, Vance and the Dying Earth has been, you know, translated into a number of languages. I do not envy the people that had to do those translations.
Yeah, that's gotta be, it's
Yeah,
own sort of dedication and
wow.
yeah, that'll be interesting to talk to some of the folks that are involved in that.
Oh man.
Yeah, I mean the whole Vance Integral Editions project, where they stripped everything back, because you don't stop to think that when a book gets published, you know, editors make changes, and then there's corrections made, and then a new publisher is working from a manuscript and they make different changes, and they sort of cascade. And so they stripped everything back to the purity of what Vance had originally put down on paper. And these were people all over the world that volunteered to do this and to put this project together. And so I think that shows the level of passion that people have once they start reading Vance, that they're going to collectively do something like that, and then collectively try and translate it into a different language. Because again, that hurts my brain to think about.
Yeah. I've got a really important question from the Twitch feed here. What does excalibrating translate to in Tagalog?
A little rusty on my Tagalog at the moment.
Thank you.
Is it actually Tagala?
Well, no, it really makes me wonder, if you're looking at the etymological roots of the words, would you then translate those root meanings to the different language and then try to come up with a new neologism? Neologism? Yeah, that's the word we're using for it.
Or do you just cheat and treat it as a proper noun and just move on? No,
Italicize it because it's foreign. And
but so much of what he was doing is also, he wasn't necessarily inventing. A lot of his words were invented, right? So a lot of the, the Vancian language is about the words that he came up with. But a lot of what he was doing was resurrecting or going back to alternative versions, historical versions of words, right? In some cases, so
the obsolete and the archaic.
Obsolete and archaic, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that could play into a translation, just going back into sort of what is the, somebody who knows a language, like similar to English, you obviously have access to the kind of the older versions of the words, and I think that's where you'd find sort of analogs for the translations, I imagine. But not having met anybody who's done that for Vance, I'd be really curious.
Well, and I think for newer readers, I think that gets amplified, because we were talking about how language has changed in the genre, right? From the 40s, 50s, 60s, is very different from the writing style of the 90s and the noughts. And so there's a lot of language, even from the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, that is now kind of fallen from usage. It's becoming obsolete. It's starting to feel archaic. And I think in a lot of ways that enhances the Dying Earth overall, but it's also, I don't know, it's also kind of sad, right? I think that authors of the time, what they put down on paper was so much more rich and evocative and
Right,
full.
and it almost goes back to the having time to thoughtfully construct your words.
So I'm gonna sum up that what you just said, Bob, as I'm personally turning 51 this month, and everything sucks now.
You know, you could even shorten it to get off my lawn. But
Yeah. So here's a question for you to slightly turn things. I was looking at the chronology because I think it was Jen, when we were emailing around earlier, was talking about what about the chronology of of how the stories were published. Is there anything interesting there and stuff? So I looked at them, and actually it's kind of a straight line from the book in the first book, I believe, in 1950 to the first Kugel stories in the mid 60s, which then get collected. And then the later Kugel stories are published a couple of them are published in the 70s. But the outlier in the midst of this, strangely, is Morion the Magician. The last of the Rialto stories gets published in 73, just in time to be a cardinal influence on Gygax, right? Because it has Ioun stones and fancy and magic and stuff like that. Although I don't know how well it might have been, it may not have been the exact same version in the Rialto text.
And all of that was before Kugel Saga?
Oh yeah, well,
Yeah,
before
it was about 10 years
Morion
before.
was,
For most of the stories in Kugel Saga. Yeah, there were a couple of stories in Kugel Saga that came out a couple years after or around the same, but yeah, it really, because that, when you look at that, like that section, the Rialto section, it's so different, than the other magician stories or the Kugel stories, and it's so far out there in terms of like extrapolating, okay, what happens when you have, sort of the power here. The things that aren't present in the Maureen stories are like the Sandistons. Those don't make an appearance, so they're not quite there. It's still like magicians doing their own sort of feats of magic, but they're doing it at sort of this exceptional level. But it has like a bunch of bizarre and wild stuff in it, for compared to like the earlier books.
Well, it's so bizarre because it's published in 73 in Flashing Swords, right? Which was like Lynn Carter's Sword and Sorcery.
It wasn't in like Flashing Swords 1?
Yes. And so, I mean, like, so first of all, if you've read Dying Earth, you've read the first, Eyes of the Overworld, the first Kugel stories or whatever, and you're a Jack Vance fan, so you're looking for this, and bang, they sock you with Morion the Magician. So you haven't read any of the Rialto stories, you haven't read any of the second half of the Kugel stories. You just get you get Morion the Magician, in which they chase an Archvolt around, try to get the Ioun stones, play games amongst each other to get, spoiler alert, play a bunch of games to get all the Ioun stones, and then they decide to go into deep space, deep to the freaking universe. I mean, crazy space travel, flying palaces, breaking, carving up planets to get at the cores of dwarf planets around dwarf stars at the literal edge of the universe, all this craziness. And it's like, what in the world, here you're reading that, I have no idea what Flashing Swords is like. I have a copy somewhere buried away, at least one copy of those. But I mean, I'm imagining you have some pretty good stuff in there, but you probably have like half Conan pastiches or something, and then you'd
have I mean, they were mostly big names. You'd have like Lynn Carter, Leiber, but yeah, then all of a sudden there's this, and it stands out very different.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you had one of a great later Fafhrd Mouser story, I mean, sure, the quality would be high, right? You'd be, oh, that was great, and you turn around and like, what in the world is I mean, so just trying to imagine what you would have made of that in 1973 without having any other Rialto stories, and perhaps without having read Dying Earth and Kugel, right? Because it's in this collection, right? So you're not.
And I wonder, like, at that time, would people have even like sort of kept it as one whole, right? Or would they have just said, this is a kind of
It's
a
another
setting where
piece,
there's there's a piece, but it wasn't. Like I said, kind of going back to what I was saying in the beginning, it's hard for me to like separate the stories now. But I think then I'm not sure there would have been as much connective tissue in people's experiences of them.
No, especially like today we have the internet. We can connect anything. We can find out how things intertwine. But back in the day, right? I mean, unless you were browsing through a copy of the volumes of books in print, you'd pick something up and there'd be a short story, and 3 years later there might be another collection that might have something by the same author. It may be something you follow up on. It might not be. You not necessarily ever know. And
Well, since I have you all here, I would like to go around. I'll start with our guest, Julian. Of this series, which of the individual stories is your favorite?
It's really easy, but I can't tell you the name of it. But I bet Mark can. It's the one where I also didn't reread any of this. Is the one book I didn't reread, so this is why I can't tell the story. But name the story, I should say. It's the one in before they go sailing on the Worminger ship, where he and the other guy are in the bar. And they're squabbling over the where Kugel, I'm saying, in Kugel's saga, they're in the bar and they're squabbling over who's going to get the passage on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And then they start doing the progressively crazier bets, like they can't resolve. And it's just totally slapstick. I mean, it just makes me laugh out loud every time I read it. And Vance makes me laugh out loud, both in Kugel's stuff and also in some of the other stuff like The Face and The Demon Princes. I mean, he's one of the few authors that actually, I mean, it's usually more of a chortle or a snicker than an uproarious guffaw. But anyway, I can't remember for the life of me if that chapter has a name or what's the name of it, but...
Was it The Inn of Blue Lamps?
That sounds about right.
It's the one right before Aboard the Galante.
Yeah, that sounds right for sure.
That's a great part. I love that. And it's a lot of those are showing off the sort of whimsy that I think the language plays into the whimsy a lot, but Vance also knows how to sort of set up these situations, and that's a great scene.
So what about you, Mark? Do you have a favorite that stands out?
The Maureen story is probably my favorite out of all the sort of like encapsulated stories, and just because it is sort of like this middle ground. It's not like the full Rialto stories that he wrote later. It's not the earlier ones, the earlier Tales of the Magicians. But I always just I think that in itself is sort of like this sort of really kind of affecting story of this sort of like a figure who is sort of disparaged and sort of thrown away and cast away, and they find him, and he's sort of rediscovering himself. Then he gets angry, and then and the end of the book is very abrupt. Just like this sort of like he's sort of like cast away again, and I just love that. I don't know, for me it draws me in quite a bit to like his story and like sort of getting in, invested in it, and then it just ends with this sort of like we just put him back in his place, and now he's sort of like serving things for the magicians now going forward. Good thing we could forget about that and go back to our lives of debauchery and squabbling. I don't know, that story is probably my favorite out of all the Dying Earth stories, even the earlier ones, which I really like, the earlier 6 novels that came out first.
That may be the grimmest of endings of all the books, because he does become sort of more of a sympathetic figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at what Kugel does to those pilgrims in the eyes of the overworld, that's extremely grim, and there's a lot of grim stuff in Kugel's behavior, obviously, but
morally challenged.
Yeah, but Morion is almost worse, because I mean, here's this. Well, anyway, yeah. Sorry. Proceed.
No, you're fine. Fine, then I'll ask Bob. Do you have a particular favorite, or does it all just blend together for you as well?
But in a lot of ways, it's just for me, it's one big long story. But if I had to pick a particular high point, and much like Julian, I couldn't actually name the story, but I would refer to it as Kugel ruins the Grand Exposition of Marvels.
Oh, yeah.
It just all of the character interplay that goes on there, and Kugel's not morally challenged, he's morally bankrupt. Let's be fair, he is not a nice person. He's sort of like the Deadpool of the dying earth. But I really kind of enjoy that. I enjoy, there's intrigue, there's almost a there's the story, that particular story almost has a commedia dell'arte feel to it, where it's definitely an older form of story being told in a new way. So you have real intrigue, but you also have kind of this underlying comedy of errors that has this overlay of just a horrible person trying to do horrible things for his own benefit. And I am fond of that particular portion of the stories. What about you, Jan?
No, sir, I don't like it. Coming straight from Falford and the Grey Mouser, I'm like, this is everything Falford should never be and will never be, and Kugel just needs to go. And once in a while, Karma would slap him upside the head, and I'd be like, about time. So no, my favorite is still from the original, the story of Sais.
Yeah.
I've it's not that I have a fondness for the Vat thing. There were so many flaws in her form as she was created, but she didn't realize it. And there was something about that I just found, on a deep personal level, I found that to be just super fitting. And when to Sane, I can't figure out if it's to Sais or Sais or yeah, okay. But when the other one is created, to Sane, I believe it is. That one is created with some of the qualities that Sais doesn't have. And they kind of complement each other, but one is forced to put the other one essentially back in the vat for reprocessing. And yeah, that's the one that's sticking with me even through all these years since we first read it.
That is a good story. But again,
So
they all are.
I dig the magic, and like all of you, yeah, Vancian magic was just okay, something that was referred to in the player's handbook. Yeah, that's about it.
Those two stories are actually the first two, I think, to me, are actually pretty affecting, and it seems like that's about as emotional as it gets. And then it kind of descends into this, it gets kind of proceedingly more colder and more immoral or amoral with Kugel and with Rialto. But it's funny because a lot of the stuff that I've read of Vance is kind of along those lines, or maybe, revenge stories where the, kind of Count of Monte Cristo is where their demon princes, Gerson is out to, get revenge on the bad guys for what they did to Earth or whatever. But so they're moralistic, not that the good guys are that good, but they're moralistic. But Leoness made me cry. Like, Leoness is a totally different ball of wax. So Vance is
the follow-up series, right?
Yeah, well, not Dying Earth, but yeah, it's a later thing that he wrote.
Lioness, yeah.
Yeah, whatever.
Another one of those.
Yeah, and ask tomorrow. But anyway, there is stuff where he does, it's not all one note, and he's capable of a lot of shades of stuff too. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend hours peeling back layers on Vance.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the earlier stories, there was a different set of moral values that are presented, and even hope, right? I think there's some, even though the context is the end of the world, but a little bit, but I mean,
Just
like the
a
Gaio story, you know, it kind of ends on this sort of note of we've rediscovered, you know, or we've sort of relived the history of humanity and got to see all these sort of events that nobody else knows about, and so we're sort of not quite Adam and Eve like figures, but they're sort of, you know, they're presented with this knowledge that nobody else has, and it's sort of what happens next is a, you know, it's less about Kugel sort of, you know, enjoying a life of, you know, pleasure, you know, at the end of his stories, and not really ever seeing sort of a, you know, a complete circle back to, you know it's going to happen, but you know, but his ends on like this sort of like, you know, why is he getting, you know, getting to enjoy this? Sort of.
Well, folks, unfortunately, this is gonna be about it. That's gonna wrap up our time. To those of you who tuned in to the Twitch broadcast, thank you so much for your comments, your commentary, and your viewership. And to our listeners, please feel free to hit us up with any feedback. It's thehub@sanctum.media. And a very special thank you to our co-hosts, Bob and Mark, and to our guest, Judge Julian. And it's really weird to call you a guest. And as the end of Gaialov's sphere alludes to, Earth will need knowledge now more than ever. And we hope we've inspired you to read some Dying Earth.
And join us tomorrow when we get to talk to John Vance.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks all. Game on.
Game on.